Were recently handed out to 4 editors of independent newspapers for speculating on the health of the president. His well-being has become a topic of interest amongst the Egyptian public ever since they watched their president faint during a session of parliament in November 2003. Yet even at 83 years old, Mubarak is still being portrayed by government media as forever young, forever healthy, seemingly immune to the forces of nature. The president's health has become a matter of deep importance for the stability of the state.
What's really sad is that Egypt is so weak that the illness of its president can shake its economy. So how can this media machine of theirs be talking to us about stability and continuity, constitutional organizations and legal systems? Can it all disappear just like that, in a cloud of smoke? I truly believe that the worst thing which came out of this is the government admitting that if the president disappears or falls ill, then the state will collapse.
The truth is, nobody is sure what will happen to Egypt once Mubarak is gone. The question is increasingly being asked, but the answers are few and far between. And as they have done throughout the ages, Egyptians are just waiting.
He's taken stolen goods and he's now dumping them onto the world without any sort of consideration for consequences.
From people making the news.
If the North will be saved a lot of trouble, I think it is important that they should come together.
To those it affects.
We do accept that there was very bad mistakes made in our banking area.
Behind the headlines.
Most South Koreans are not interested in reunification.
Is the inside story. At this time on Al Jazeera.
On the next Riz Khan show, as speculation mounts over the return of ousted former President Aristide, we discuss Haiti's unexpected political twists. Riz Khan, at this time on Al Jazeera.
The times change. The instruments evolve. The battlegrounds shift.
This is America! Our country!
But the international struggle continues.
He was murdered!
Uncompromising, hard-hitting investigations.
I can't get no justice from no one in Jamaica.
People and power, at this time on Al Jazeera.
Afghanistan is faced with a huge challenge.
Relations have gone really sour between us and our allies.
We have inflicted considerable damage on the enemy.
The people who make international headlines.
Ultimately, the truth will out.
They want to stop this publication of information that embarrasses them.
Make time for Sir David Frost. Frost over the world. On Al Jazeera.
Volunteer tourism is booming in Cambodia, with more and more foreigners helping out in the country's orphanages and schools. But with claims of mismanagement and corruption, are these projects doing more harm than good? 101 East at this time on Al Jazeera.
Mass protests enter their 17th day in Egypt, with thousands more workers expected to take to the streets. The time is 0700 GMT. That means it's 9 o'clock in the morning in Egypt, where the government is resisting growing pressure from the White House to meet the demands of the protesters. I'm Shuli Ghosh, and you're watching Al Jazeera live from Doha. Also coming up, a suicide bomber in a school uniform attacks a Pakistani army base, killing 30 soldiers. The New York Stock Exchange in merger talks. It may soon have German owners. And were they kidnapped or weren't they? Embarrassment for the Mexican army over a supposed rescue mission. Egypt must do more to satisfy the protesters. That's the message from the United States as anti-Mubarak demonstrations continue. But the Egyptian president refuses to go, and his government continues to resist calls for quick reforms, saying any change will be gradual. Well, these are the scenes live from Cairo's Tahrir Square, where protesters remain defiant, demanding that Mubarak step down. Thousands of workers have launched their own calls for change, with strikes and protests continuing around the country. Meanwhile, talks between opposition groups and the vice president continue to go nowhere. Let's go live to Al Jazeera's Stephanie Decker, who's in central Cairo for us. Stephanie, the fact that state workers, impoverished Egyptians, are now getting involved in strikes in Egypt, how is that changing the tone of the protests?
Well, it's certainly increasing the pressure on the government here. I think it's worth making the distinction that the strikes going on are more of an economic nature. They're not necessarily jumping on the bandwagon of the protesters in Tahrir Square, that's Liberation Square. Many of them not actually calling for the president to step down, but fighting for better wages, for better working conditions. Of course, many people here work on a daily wage basis. So also the problem that's been happening here over the past 2.5 weeks now is that many people haven't been getting paid. Also, banks are today fully back to normal, but again, there's a restriction on cash that you can pull out of the cash machines. Many people, food prices are soaring here. People still panic buying to a certain extent. So there really is a feeling of unease, even though the scenes you're seeing of a quieter nature than they were about a week ago. So really all these things going on. We've got many more strikes happening today across the country. Many workers, we know that around 5,000 doctors will be marching in their white medical gowns, and medical students will be marching to the square today. So the momentum here really still very much keeping the pressure on the government.
You mentioned the doctors there who are going to be involved in a march later on. Of course, all unions in Egypt have to be sanctioned by the government. Are there any major unions involved in these protests?
Well, it's worth pointing out that at the moment there isn't a national strike in terms of workers here. The government employees make up about 6 million. That's out of 80 million of the population. And the government also recently put out a statement that it would be increasing their pay. That's the government employees' pay by 15% by April. But really that hasn't appeased anyone here. There's a real sense of nervousness about where the direction that which this country is taking. And also it is facing difficult economic times. It relies heavily on tourism. 1 million tourists fled this country in the first 9 days of these protests. The pyramids that everyone comes here to see have been empty. They reopened yesterday, but not a single tourist was seen. The ancient markets of Khan el-Khalili usually bustling with tourists. Half of those shops remain closed. Shopkeepers telling us that 70% of their revenues are down. So really, it's the political will of the people here coming at quite a high cost as well.
So obviously looking at Tahrir Square now, I mean, it just looks like a tent city in the middle of Cairo. The dialogue still not working between the vice president and some of the protest organizers. Many people suspicious that Suleiman isn't sincere about bringing in any changes.
No, and I think anyone you ask in that square says that they don't care about dialogue. They have one message, and that message hasn't changed here for the last 17 days. It's very clear, and the message doesn't seem to be getting through. It's President Mubarak needs to stand down. Now, yes, there's been dialogue going on. There's been mixed messages coming out from the government. We had the Omar Suleiman, the vice president, yesterday come out and say that he didn't want these protests weren't feasible to continue for much longer, that there were only two options. That's dialogue or a coup. Now, that really didn't go down very well with the protesters. What they read into that, so to speak, was that he was perhaps threatening a military coup, the imposition of martial law. So what they're saying, the bottom line is they don't care about dialogue. They don't care about negotiations, about constitutional reform. Yes, they want constitutional reform, but they definitely don't want it under this government. They don't want it with President Mubarak still in charge, and the calls continue very strongly here that they want him to stand down, and they're not going to be going anywhere until he does.
Okay, Stephanie, thanks for that. Stephanie Decker in Cairo there. Well, of course, the capital isn't the only city where Egyptians are protesting. Alexandria in the north has also seen thousands of people out on the streets. Emeka Omolu has more on the protests there and other events over the last 24 hours.
Gamal, tell your father the Egyptian people don't like him. Words from a young protester who's helping to keep spirits up among anti-Mubarak crowds in Alexandria. Such scenes are now repeated daily in Egypt's second largest city. Like demonstrators in Cairo, these crowds are holding their ground. On Wednesday, their cause got an added boost. The Egyptian Telecommunications Building in downtown Cairo. About 200 workers demanding better pay and benefits. Thousands more across Egypt were holding similar strikes. Some say it's also in solidarity with those who want President Mubarak out.
Al-Mahal Al-Kubra is considered to be a pivotal city for a change in Egypt. Our company is suffering losses, and it is also manipulated by a group of corrupt management. Meanwhile, we also support our fellow demonstrators in Tahrir Square for the change of the regime.
3 independent trade unions joined the day of mass action, also disrupting services in Suez and Port Said. This is a new dimension to the uprising. To lead a union in Egypt, you generally need government approval. The fact that these bodies now appear to be mobilizing against the state doesn't bode well. Right now, neither side in the crisis is wavering. Earlier on Wednesday, a group of prominent figures who call themselves the Wise Men met with Vice President Omar Suleiman to discuss a possible transfer of power, and like others before, didn't get very far.
The official position, be it from the Vice President or the Prime Minister's position, is that the President is going to remain in office until September, and that he continues to practice his authorities and that he is responsible for putting Egypt on democratic transition.
Not what people living in tent cities in Cairo and Alexandria want to hear. Emeka Omolu, Al Jazeera.
Well, in Cairo, the protests have spilled out of Liberation Square, spreading to other parts of the city. Hundreds of anti-Mubarak demonstrators have now set up camp outside Parliament. It's a sign that the protests are entering a new phase, with people taking their message for Mubarak to go.